Me and the kid were down here a couple weeks ago, and I had my household organic waste with me and just dumped it here. So that's not a good thing. I'm going to share with you 4 reasons why, or kind of 4 management tips for handling farm scale compost. So first off, we got a little campfire area not that far from here. I dug up the charcoal and a little bit of the soil that was there as I'm cleaning up the fire pit. I have another challenge with the compost. It's just kind of dumped here, and what you'll notice, these are actually cattle panel rings, by the way. I got a program on Composting Made Easy, and I show you how to put these things together, but it's a cattle paddle ring. Cattle paddle ring. Anyway, you can see where raccoons got in here and pulled some of the material out. Now, why did that happen? So the first tip is you always want to cover your compost material. So I threw in vegetable scraps and greens and you know, it looks like some zucchini in there, some old pumpkins. I want to cover that with an inch or so of material so that 2 things happen. Number 1, we don't have any odor or smell, and number 2, we don't have any contact points for flies. So if you dump this material in here, you got to cover it up with something. I tend to want to use hay or straw or wood chips or some kind of organic material, but if I don't have that kind of organic material, I can use a high carbon source such as this charcoal, or the material that I got here. I don't know if you remember the other video, but I cleared the trailer off. There's this other material here. So this is leaf mixture compost, so leaf and grass clippings. So the key is if your materials are covered, the smaller animals, the rodents, are going to keep out of it. So now you could have brush material like this over here and run it through a chipper and throw those chips on. That's fine, or you can leave it as a brush pile. But you have to understand, brush piles like this are going to be a place for animals to hide. And if you've got rodents hiding next to your plant nursery or hiding next to compost piles, then you have the potential for problems. You can see here's another brush pile here. So these brush piles will be reduced by, number 1, harvesting the materials for firewood. We do have a burn pile near here that we use for campfires, so I can harvest materials, but those small brush materials can be thrown into the bottom of a layer of compost, and then I'm going to throw material on top of that. Now, that's called capping off your pile. So I'm going to cap off the pile, but when I want to add new materials, what do? Well, first off, when I bring new materials, I want to make a little basin in the top of the mound. Now, I'm not going to show you all this stuff because I got work to do. But if you come out for a class, we'll go through it. The point I'm making, though, is that little basin in the top, that indentation, is where you're going to pour your next materials, and then you're going to cap that off. Now, you might notice a lot of cardboard here. I don't bother to break down the cardboard. I do take the plastic off it. I see a little piece of plastic there. But this cardboard goes up around the edges. It will block airflow, but I want to be able to throw my materials in the center and it not spill out the sides. We want to keep the core of this pile thick. Now, the biggest challenge you're going to have is not having enough materials to really make a good pile. So I'm not going to turn this pile. I'm going to simply layer in materials that I have: leaves, grass clippings, shredded materials. In this case, we have wood ash and charcoal pieces, cardboard boxes. You know, there's gourds in here. There's, you know, different waste vegetables and stuff. I'm going to fill this thing all the way up to the very top and then let it sit for a year. So I'm following a method that would be compatible with a humanure system, because I may put in here actual humanure. So I'm at a property right now that I use for camping sometimes, and when we camp, we don't have black water. We don't have a toilet system. We use a bucket system or a composting toilet type system, and then when we leave the property, we're going to put that in this pile. But you don't do that unless, again, you have enough layer materials to put on top of your pile, because you don't want stuff getting in and out of the pile itself. Another factor that you want to consider is accessibility. So I put this compost pile here. I used to be able to back a truck right up to it. Now I've got other storage material in this particular spot. So I've got to be mindful to keep this spot clear. And by the way, this pile right here, this was compost off the trailer, and I noticed it had a lot of bulbs in it. And so rather than picking out all the bulbs, I left the pile right here, because next season I can turn this pile into the middle here and then turn it again to get closer, and then finally turn it onto the pile there. It's better to have 1 or 2 very large piles of compost than many small piles of compost. So essentially this pile is simply just to sprout, find the bulbs, and then pull them out next season when they can be planted out in the property. Another factor I'm working on too is every one of these potted plants, they're only going to stay in the pots for 3 or 4 months. So these over here are going to overwinter, and then we're going to have places for them to go. There'll be, all this stuff will be taken out of here and planted somewhere, because we want to be planting stuff, not storing stuff. We don't want to store plants all over the property. So now I just picked up this branch that fell. Is this branch too big to go in the compost? Well, another tip I have for you is that you can compost just about anything. I'm going to throw that in the pile because it's just one branch. And once you layer down materials, you'll find that the pile shrinks. It just keeps getting smaller and smaller. Now, part of that getting smaller is evaporating nutrients, or even methane, because it's digesting. But again, we're not turning this pile because it could contain manure or human excrement, waste. I know that sounds kind of gross, but this is a consistent way of managing that kind of thing, especially at very low volumes. So it's more likely going to have household vegetable scraps, rotten vegetables from a garden, things that are not processed in an urban space. So I still live in an urban space. I bring those materials here and throw them in here rather than having compost piles on the property. Now I've had, each one of these rings will hold 2 cubic yards of material. You can almost get a 2.5 cubic yards. I've had on my property as much as 8 cubic yards of compost. It will not smell. If you do this the right way, it will not smell. And the right way, again, is to layer in materials, to give preference to carbonous materials, and to not turn the pile if it has things that are like a lot of rotten vegetables. You know, if there was a dead cat or something, or a dead raccoon, you don't want to be turning that pile all the time. You want to essentially build the pile up until it has a certain amount of volume, and then make sure that pile is left alone so that it can naturally break down. And then I lift this ring off, turn the pile a couple times then, after it has been able to sit and the microbes have done their job. Now, what about adding minerals? What about adding beneficial enzymes and microbes and stuff like that? Well, you can do that kind of thing with a static pile. That's kind of what I'm talking about here, a static pile. But I'm going to get such a variety of materials in here, and you can see old oatmeal containers and egg crates and cardboard boxes with the plastic all pulled off of it. All this stuff is just layered and layered and layered. And being that it may have human manure in it, it doesn't, but it would if I was out here more often. It's not something we're going to put in a garden. So again, it's going to be part of a tree nursery. So I'm not as concerned about putting a lot of nutrients into it. I'm not going to buy nutrients. If I find, so for example, if I end up with a bunch of coffee grounds, I'll just dump them in here. Okay. So this is almost the lazy man's way to compost. Now in my book, Composting Made Easy, there are more, you can have compost in 30 days. You can have compost ready to go in a very short period of time. That's not what we're talking about here. It'll take at least a year after it's been full to the top before this will break down and become compost. And that's okay, because again, it's out here in the woods. Any of these plants that die, I'm just going to dump the pot in here. It's very high utility value. This is not about making quick compost, because if I had quick compost, where am I going to put it? Like, I can't, compost expires. You just can't leave compost pile in your yard for a couple months even. It needs to go on a garden area. It needs to go in your growing space. So if I fill this up to the top with material and it sits for another year, it'll be potting mix for trees. It'll be potting mix for plant starts. It won't be hauled anywhere. Now the pile that I have on the other side over there that I showed you, that is my set aside topping for my, it's almost like a layer cake. So you do need to have old straw bales, leaves, leaf piles, grass clippings, whatever, because the more household organic waste that you put in here, the more you're going to need to layer materials over top here. So I was lazy when we're out here camping, and I just dumped the compost in, and you can see eggshells and tea bags and you know, old cabbages and stuff like that. I just dumped them on the top. That's kind of lazy, and you can see how, you know, a raccoon or something had gotten into it and started pulling some materials away. So what I'll do is I'll go around the outside and scoop up those materials and throw them on the top, and then I will cap it off with this material here, and the boxes will be on the outer edges because we don't want the materials to fall through the sides until it's good and rotten down. Will I bother raking up all the leaves out here and layering the leaves on? Not necessarily, because I don't need to have the leaves. I got enough dirt here, enough charcoal and stuff like that to layer it out. But yeah, maybe I would. The key is we're building this pile for the long term, and it's okay to put bulk material into it because it's going to sit for a while. Compost is your most valuable resource on the property. If you come across an opportunity to get coffee grounds, waste vegetables that you wouldn't feed to animals, other things like that, it's perfect for compost. But I want to leave you with one last thing. I have a compost pile here for two reasons. Number one is we may have human manure on site. Number two is we don't have animals to process the organic waste. So if we had hogs or chickens, we could take the organic waste, that's vegetable scraps, table scraps, that kind of stuff, and we could feed it to those animals and convert it to proteins. In the case of human manure, that's an isolated system that has protective measures to prevent any disease or any groundwater contamination or anything like that. And that would be, again, that's a completely different system. But the mustard greens and the old pumpkins and all that stuff is better utilized with an animal system because you're going to turn low value vegetable waste into high value proteins. Even though in a gardening situation we can turn compost into nutritious vegetables, the vegetables don't have as many calories and don't have as much protein as you would get out of an animal system. So we could feed those scraps to a chicken, and the chicken could then make waste in their bedding, and then that bedding could be composted quickly and turned into a topping for your garden. Then you've got an extra cycle. So if you have questions about that, that's called the energy cycling or the stacking of function. Right now, all I'm really talking about is how to put a lot of compost together with very little effort, because as a static pile, it's serving some particular needs and it doesn't require a lot of time and effort. So I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead, and our goal is to help you get a small farm or a homestead up and running, operational, day-to-day activities going like they should, it producing food security, it producing physical security, it producing a lifestyle for you that cannot be taken away because it is foundational, it is regenerative, it is building yourself up both mentally and spiritually, and you can do that on a farm. I'd love to hear your stories. I'd love to hear about your challenges, and I'll do my very best to answer your questions and get you additional content. This has been about how to manage a static compost pile and some of the things you can do and some examples about stacking function. Again, thanks for watching. Thanks for being a part of what we do here today. It is my great pleasure to serve you in these areas, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments.